Welcome back. Time for the 10-year reunion as our NFL insider Ralph Vacchiano joins Chris and I. The Giants are the only New York team to bring a championship down the Canyon of Heroes in the 2010s. But the last few years have been marred by lack of success on the gridiron and controversies, plenty of them off of it. Now, Ralph was tasked with curating the Big Blue All-Decade team, and it starts with Tom Coughlin. The head coach from 2010 to 2015 started off the decade with 3 winning seasons and, of course, led the G-Men to a Super Bowl 46 win over Bill Belichick and the Patriots. At quarterback, who else but Eli Manning? He had more success in the previous decade, but pulled in another Super Bowl MVP as he outdueled Tom Brady on the biggest stage and went out on a high note Sunday at MetLife.
That's right. And at running back, Justine, Ahmad Bradshaw rushed for a team-high 23 touchdowns to go with over 2,900 yards. The top 3 in receiving touchdowns all make the list with Hakeem Nicks, Odell Beckham Jr., and the salsa dancing Victor Cruz. And current Giant Evan Ingram holds down the tight end spot. Meanwhile, all the offensive linemen on Ralph's list are from the early part of the decade, with none of them playing past 2013. But hard to argue against any of these guys who made up the Super Bowl O-line from the 2011
We
season.
know how important offensive lines are. Let's get to Big Blue's defensive stars. Jason Pierre-Paul, who had a decade-high 58.5 sacks. Justin Tuck is second on that list. And Damon Harrison is the only player to appear on both the Jets and Giants all-decade teams on the threat. In the secondary, Corey Webster and Antrell Roll both had 14 interceptions, best on Los Gigantes for the decade, while Landon Collins was second on the team in tackles. Now, Ralph's kicker is Lawrence Tynes, Steve Weatherford is the punter, and the returner is Dwayne Harris. So, Ralph, first thing I noticed was no Saquon, but what were the hardest decisions for you in making this team?
Saquon just hasn't done enough yet to qualify for that all-decade team, but the hardest decisions, well, you mentioned the offensive line. It was just a wasteland for most of the decade. The good thing was they had a really good offensive line in the beginning part, so that helped. Linebacker, though, what a disastrous decade. For a franchise that had Lawrence Taylor, Harry Carson, Carl Banks, they had almost nobody throughout this decade. That was the toughest position to fill.
Now, the only guy, Ralph, who's made it this entire decade is Eli Manning. What do you think this decade did for his legacy, considering the Super Bowl run?
It complicated it, to be perfectly honest. I think his best years were in the 2007 to 2012 range. Obviously, he won the 2 Super Bowls, but that's a lot of time in this decade where he was average, where, he lost a lot of games. I think that anybody who wants to dismiss him as a Hall of Fame candidate will point to 2013 on. It wasn't all his fault, but the numbers aren't there.
And what's actually impressive about Eli Manning, he was relatively injury-free, which is really impressive in this day and age for this league.
Absolutely, and that's a big mark in his favor, that he was able to endure for so many years, never get hurt. Honestly, if it wasn't for an unfortunate benching, his Ironman streak would have continued until this year.
No, I agree.
Let's talk about Tom Coughlin. Was dismissed from the Jaguars front office yesterday. How important was he to the Giants in this decade? Do you see a reunion in the works, possibly now that he's on the market?
I would be surprised if it was a reunion. I suppose there's always the chance that he gets some sort of ceremonial role or something. The Giants obviously love him, the front office does, but I think his time in the NFL is probably over. And honestly, I don't think the Giants want to tarnish his legacy. What he did for them, and this straddles the decade, obviously, because he did a lot before 2010, was he turned this franchise around, turned them back into a contender. And obviously, for him, it didn't work out as the decade went along, but how could you forget what he did in 2000?
But maybe Tom Coughlin is what they need. Maybe that's the resurgence to get the Giants back to where they belong.
If you said coach, I might agree with you. He's never really been the best executive, though.
No, I can't argue with you there. All right, there was obviously the Super Bowl 46 win, a couple of postseason appearances, but considering the off-the-field headlines, Ralph, how much did it hurt the pristine image of the Giants? Because early on it was like they're a clean-cut class organization.
Yeah, it's not the way the decade ended. They had a lot of controversies, obviously. You look back to the Ben McAdoo era, that second year, you had basically player revolts going on. That didn't that didn't make them look very good at all. The image of this team under Tom Coughlin, rightly or wrongly, was they were a button-down organization. They did the right thing. It's not that way, or it wasn't that way in the last half of the decade.
All right, Ralph, so if you had to pick one, what do you think your craziest day was covering the Giants, considering some of the things that we've seen the last couple seasons?
Yeah, there were a few. The day they fired both Jerry Reese and Ben McAdoo was so out of character for this organization. I almost went with that. But for this decade, it's hard to miss the day that Eli Manning was benched for Geno Smith, because it really, in a lot of ways, came out of nowhere. It was made by a head coach that didn't really seem to have a lot of authority. And it was for Geno Smith, who we all knew wasn't the quarterback of the future. So it was such an absurd day, so upsetting for Eli Manning, and quite frankly, a lot of his former teammates as well. It was really a low point for the organization.
I was here that day. I think we worked on Geico Sports Night together that day. It was definitely a crazy one. I think the boat trip and the fallout of that has got to be up there, too.
That was up there, too. That was nuts. That whole playoff experience with Odell punching the wall after the game as well, that was just a big mess.
It's a lot.